What's in a name? Take these two candy bars. This one has nuts and caramel, while this one has raspberry filling. They're both covered with milk chocolate. But here's the thing. Not everybody defines chocolate the same way. So are they both chocolate bars? That depends on who you ask. Back in 1992, a group called the European Union, or EU, was created by the Treaty on European Union, also known as the Maastricht Treaty. The European Union grew out of the European Community, which was created after World War II to unite Europe economically as a way to avoid war in the future. And one of the big ideas behind the EU is that there is power in numbers. The EU started with 15 member nations. Today, there are 25 member countries covering about 500 million people. EU members have had their own monetary system since 1999. This is the euro, which can be used in most member countries. Besides having a common currency, EU nations also work together on health and environmental issues. In October of 2004, the EU wrote up its own constitution for its members to consider. It has also created what is called a Rapid Reaction Corps, a common army made up of soldiers from the member nations. These troops are used only when the EU leadership decides they are needed. However, member nations have the right to refuse to participate in this common army. The EU army of 100,000 soldiers, 400 combat planes, and 100 warships has been called into action largely for humanitarian missions in places like Kosovo and Sudan. Working together has lots of advantages, but it also means compromise, which brings us back to the whole idea of chocolate. An independent country or sovereign nation like the US makes its own rules about what goes into a chocolate bar. But EU countries have to come up with a single definition. And that's why EU members recently found themselves fighting the chocolate wars. Everybody loves chocolate, but Europeans seem to really love it. Western Europeans eat almost half of all the chocolate in the world. And European chocolate makers are proud of their product. It's made with only the finest ingredients. Or at least some European chocolate is made in the traditional way, using only cocoa butter in the recipe. But other chocolate manufacturers combine cocoa butter with less expensive vegetable fats. And when the countries of the EU came together, the different recipes for chocolate was one of the stickiest issues for members to work out.
Well, British chocolate makers have been making chocolate with cocoa butter and adding sort of vegetable fat. Other European countries view that as not perfect chocolate. They only like to use the cocoa butter. So when the EU was formed, they didn't want to allow Britain to call what they're making chocolate, even though Britain's been making it for centuries that way. And that's basically what was known as the chocolate wars, as the EU came together to have a standardized, unified way of commerce and cooperation. Individual national standards were being questioned.
Balancing the individual needs of countries with the needs of the group is one of the challenges in a cooperative system such as the EU. But here at home, this isn't an issue.
Because the United States is not part of an organization like the European Union, basically what we want to do, we can do. And how we want to make chocolate can be called chocolate. And, also on the other side of that, how we want to wage war is how we want to wage war. We don't need to seek anyone else's permission as a legal matter to do what we want to do. That doesn't mean we don't reach out to other countries when we fight wars or when we have trade to get consensus diplomatically. But whether we're forced to do that, I think the answer is no.
The struggle over chocolate labeling came to an end in 2003. When the EU passed the Chocolate Directive. The directive was basically a compromise between the two sides. Great Britain and other countries were allowed to replace cocoa butter with vegetable fats if they wanted to, but only if they renamed their products. They're now called family chocolate. The chocolate wars are only one example of an issue that required EU members to compromise. It makes sense for member countries to band together in order to increase their ability to protect themselves and to create economic opportunities. But it is also true that working with more than 20 nations to make important economic, military, and political decisions is tough for countries that want to maintain their national identities and independence. The United States is not in the same position as EU nations. Our country answers to no one except itself. As the last remaining superpower, the United States doesn't really need to turn to other countries for help. This puts us in a unique position when dealing with other countries. Some say our international policies show our independence. Others believe we're becoming isolated from the rest of the world. Since the George W. Bush administration came into power, the administration has made a point of deciding for itself much more frequently than other recent administrations. For instance, 141 nations have signed the Kyoto Treaty, which aims to help the environment by limiting carbon dioxide emissions from industrialized countries. The United States has refused to sign.
There is a tremendous difference between President Bill Clinton's administration and President George Bush's administration and how they deal with international agreements. The best example is the Kyoto Treaty, which was a comprehensive environmental treaty. Hundreds of nations were willing to sign on to help with the environment on a global, sort of worldwide effort. Bill Clinton endorsed the Kyoto Treaty and wanted to work with nations even though it may not have been ideal. President George Bush, early on in his administration, walked away from the treaty for two reasons. First is he thought it was bad for America and not in America's interest. And second, he thought maybe there might be a better treaty out there to address environmental problems. So it's a very different attitude towards both international agreements and dealing with the international community on global problems.
The Bush administration also refused to participate in the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court. This court settles disputes between countries under international law.
President Bush's administration believes that we're the remaining superpower, and that means that we can create our own rules for ourselves, whether it's how we wage war or how we deal with other countries economically or about the environment or about trade.
The U.S. may value its independence, but some other nations question the fact that we are increasingly going our own way. And if we want to continue to have strong relationships around the world, that's something we'll have to consider. The truth is, with technology, rapid air travel, and multinational corporations, the lines that separate nation from nation are becoming blurrier than ever before. The question going forward is, should nations always make independent decisions? Is it better to be in charge of your own destiny, no matter the cost, or are there times that cooperation and compromise is a better choice? Members of the European Union are grappling with these ideas and working out complex national issues every day. Perhaps it's because we're far from Europe or because we are such a dominant force on the world stage. Whatever the reason, the U.S. doesn't really have to abide by the laws and economic policies of other countries. And we don't really have to compromise much either. The United States is a unique country in a unique position. Will that mean that in the future we're on our own? It's an interesting question to think about. The U.S. values its independence from other nations. How do you think globalization, the integration of different nations' economies, politics, cultures, and societies, might affect the U.S. approach? The European Union has already deployed troops around the world and is working to strengthen its common army. How might this affect the U.S.'s role as the world's only remaining superpower? One of the most controversial issues in America today is whether or not people should be able to own guns. And it's interesting that we're not the first generation to have had trouble with the idea. The Bill of Rights was signed into law in 1791. It included the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which says, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." But how we interpret those words has changed over the years. Less than 50 years after they were written, Georgia passed a law banning handguns. That law was later ruled unconstitutional and thrown out. In the 1930s, Congress passed the National Firearms Act to regulate submachine guns and other fully automatic weapons. We're still working out automatic weapons regulations today. The Federal Assault Weapons Ban, or AWB, was passed in 1994 and prohibited the sale of semi-automatic assault weapons. But the 10-year ban expired in 2004, and it's unlikely to be renewed. And of course, there is the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, named for an assistant to President Ronald Reagan. James Brady was shot during an assassination attempt on the president. This law was meant to prohibit certain people from ever getting handguns and to slow down the process for anyone who might want to purchase a gun during a fit of anger. The hotly contested Brady law initially required a 5-day waiting period for gun purchasers, as well as a criminal background check. That's now been replaced by the instant check system used by the FBI. NICS, or National Instant Criminal Background Check System, screens potential gun buyers to find out if they are listed in a federal database as a person who should not be allowed to purchase a weapon due to criminal behavior or other reasons. So, over the years, Americans have been left with a number of important questions regarding guns and gun ownership. Who is actually allowed to bear arms in this country? Exactly what kind of arms are we allowed to bear? Do the answers to these questions change over time or stay the same? What really does the Second Amendment mean? Most Americans want an end to gun violence. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention shows that nearly 3,000 children and teens died from gunfire in the U.S. in 2002. That's nearly one child killed every 3 hours. The problem is that we disagree on a couple of fundamental issues. First, why does gun violence exist? And second, what can we do to stop it?
Believers in gun ownership focus on the language in the Second Amendment that talks about the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Believers in regulating gun ownership or doing away with private gun ownership focus on the reference in the Second Amendment to a well-regulated militia. And they take that to mean that gun ownership is tied towards military defense in society and not to private gun ownership.
Two bills put before Congress show how differently the two sides view the situation. The Firearms Safety and Consumer Protection Act of 2005 would expand government control over the manufacture, distribution, and sale of firearms and ammunition. One of its stated goals is to restrict the availability of weapons that pose an unreasonable risk of death or injury. But the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act of 2003, which was voted down by the Senate but passed by the House of Representatives and was supported by President George W. Bush, was designed to stop lawsuits against firearm manufacturers whose guns were used to commit crimes. These lawmakers wanted full blame to rest on the criminals, not on the people who make firearms.
It's a question of whether you remove something that could potentially do harm because it's intrinsically harmful, or whether you trust that people will do the responsible thing when they have guns. And both sides point to the law to make their case.
The leaders of the American Revolution had no problems with citizens having guns. The Founding Fathers were more concerned that the country be able to defend itself.
The Founding Fathers disagreed about a lot of things, but one of the things they were unanimous about was their belief that people had the right to arm themselves, because the fear was that as a young nation we were at risk of being a despotic government or being invaded by a despotic government. So people like Patrick Henry said that the only way to protect our liberty is through brute force, through being armed. Our second president, John Adams, said that an armed citizenry was essential to our liberty.
Early in our history, America relied on citizens to defend it. Today, we have soldiers, National Guardsmen, and police officers. And for many, our changing world brings up even more questions about what the Second Amendment means. One common argument against gun ownership is that the U.S. has such a high number of gun deaths each year. But Switzerland is one of the few nations with a higher per capita rate of gun ownership than the United States. Swiss males are actually required by law to own guns and keep them in their homes. Yet Switzerland has almost no gun crime. Lots of people argue about why so many Americans die from gunshot wounds, but nobody debates these horrible numbers. In 1998, guns were the second leading cause of death for teenagers 15 to 19 years old. The effects of gun violence can be absolutely devastating to families.
and for acting as a leader.
Tina Sherry and her family know about gun violence firsthand. Tina's 15-year-old son, Louis, was an honor roll student on his way home from a Teens Against Gang Violence meeting when he was killed by a bullet from a passing car.
As a 15-year-old, I'm going to say he was like, most 15 years old. He didn't want to do the dishes. His room was messy. He ate you out of house and home. You couldn't keep enough milk in the refrigerator. He spent most of his time at home because he was troubled, with the violence that was going on the street and with his peers.
Before Louis was so tragically killed, access to guns was on his mind.
Well, he felt that, the guns that were on the street, he couldn't understand why his peers had such easy access to them. He felt, or, the only people that should have guns are police or in the military. But not just anybody can just get a gun at any given moment, and especially where he saw his friends on both ends, those of his friends who were being killed, but also people, who were going to jail for killing and having easy access to guns. So he felt that his generation was being wiped out on both sides.
Tina Sherry says she understands why the Second Amendment was written back when the country was young, but she thinks times have changed.
The Second Amendment, I think when our founding fathers, worked on this, things were different back then. So if I was in that time, I would say, I would go for it. We need that. But in today's days, where things are so different, and especially within my community, the way that the easy access to the guns are. So in that sense, it's somehow I can't understand why it's something that we still have today. It's the right to bear arms, but police officers, within the military, people who truly, truly need it, not just to have, just for the sake of having.
But there's another response to the issue of violence. Some people believe that if law-abiding citizens are not allowed to have guns, only criminals will have guns. They believe that in order to protect themselves from exactly the kind of thing that happened to Tina Sherry's family, they must be armed. And they say the Constitution guarantees this right. Peter Paoni is concerned about safety too. He bought his first firearm in 1986 when he owned a restaurant, bar, and liquor store. But recently, a vicious assault on an elderly neighbor during a home invasion has brought the issue closer than ever.
I personally have a strong belief in the preservation of my home, my family, our lives, our property, and I just feel that typically today, the world has become more dangerous. I don't base it on illegal gun use or the right to own guns. I just believe that the crime itself dictates the rate of crime today. It's a frightening statistic.
Paoni takes gun ownership very seriously. He says his gun is always cleaned and locked up, and he gets re-qualified to use it on a regular basis. He has taken his sons to the firing range, but says it's up to them and to every citizen whether they want to own firearms in the future.
I believe wholeheartedly that it's not just a legal right to own and bear arms. It's a privilege. It's a very deep responsibility to say, I believe I should have a firearm. I mean, you have to be clear, and you have to come to terms with yourself first and foremost of why you need to own a firearm and what you're going to do once you do own that firearm. But it has to be viewed more so as a privilege. It's a privilege to be regarded as an individual found fit to own a firearm. And I do believe that there are guidelines and there should be limits.
Americans have argued over how and when to regulate guns almost from the day the Second Amendment was signed into law. People on both sides have good points to make and often use the same statistics, such as death tolls, to make them. There are more gun-related deaths in the U.S. than anywhere else in the world, especially among young people. That's an unacceptable fact. On the other hand, statistics from other countries show that social and cultural conditions may have a lot more to do with the nation's crime rate than the number of guns available. The truth is that how people interpret the Second Amendment has changed over the years and will likely continue to do so. That should leave all of us arguing over what gun ownership means for a long time to come. How might the Second Amendment reflect events that were going on in America at the time the Constitution was created? Do you think the Second Amendment stands the test of time? Why or why not? The Second Amendment does not spell out exactly who can purchase arms or what types of weapons these must be. Who should make these decisions? Ever seen one of these signs? It keeps people off of land that doesn't belong to them. You won't see one of these signs in Yosemite National Park or the Grand Canyon. One of the coolest things this country has ever done is to create a set of laws that puts land aside just for us, its people. These public lands belong to every American. Even Americans without a dime to their name own some pretty impressive real estate. But not every piece of public land is a natural wonder. Some of it is working land, land set aside for mining or timber. And, depending on where you live in this country, your opinion of who should be in charge of public lands might differ. In the more densely populated East, for instance, public land usually refers to undeveloped wilderness, such as forests or seacoasts. Having the federal government oversee these lands helps keep towns and local businesses from building on them. In the West, ranchers, loggers, and miners work on large parcels of public land. Here, federal control of these lands is often viewed as being too restrictive and not responsive to the needs of the people who work the land. Many Westerners want these lands to be controlled by the state instead of the federal government. They think the states have a better understanding of how land within their boundaries is best used. The story of America's public lands has been called the history of our nation, a story that includes men and women looking for better lives and fighting to keep the lives they have known. But just like many other battles fought on this soil, the battle for public land often pits two sides against each other. Sometimes it's big business versus the conservationists, and sometimes it's the rights of the individual states versus the needs of the federal government in Washington. Back when this country began, land owned by the federal government was looked at as something that could be sold off to raise money. It was also seen as a reward to be given to soldiers who'd served in the army.
The land taken from the Native Americans was seen as an asset by the new American government. In order to use that asset, they passed a series of acts in the mid-1780s to allow them to sell the land off to speculators, farmers, and planters interested in settling the western lands.
Although the Founding Fathers agreed to sell the land, how to do it was a matter of debate. Alexander Hamilton wanted to sell off large blocks of land to big business. Others wanted the land to go to the average man. For instance, Thomas Jefferson wanted to create a republic of independent farmers, selling off smaller parcels to farmers and others who wanted to own land.
As a part of that, he purchased a large tract of land, approximately one-third of the continental United States, from Napoleon in 1803. This was known as the Louisiana Purchase, which he thought would provide America with an endless supply of land for generations to come. That was the goal of the Jeffersonian policy in regard to land.
Eventually, Thomas Jefferson's view won out. The Homestead Act of 1862 allowed small farmers to get 160 acres apiece at no cost. The decision was a practical one.
The federal government sought to settle the great western territories by giving away large tracts of land. People would then move into the land, some to settle, others as speculators to resell the land. This was considered a normal part of business in 19th century America, and that policy continued until the late 19th century. When a territory became part of the Union, a part of the United States, they gave up their right to public lands. In exchange, each town was allowed to sell off its public lands to fund its schools and education system in a manner that they saw fit.
States could sell federal land to pay for prisons and roads. Sometimes states got extra land for special reasons, such as to settle the land and fight Native American uprisings. Railroads got huge chunks of land too, about 128 million acres in just 11 years. But as public lands began to disappear, public opinions began to change.
The first park was established by Abraham Lincoln in 1864. Like Thomas Jefferson, Lincoln saw the western lands as the common inheritance of the American people. He did not, however, want to see all those lands turned into farms. Some of those he wanted to preserve for the common good and for common enjoyment. He established Yosemite as the first national park, effectively, in 1864.
Other national parks followed. The government set aside land for parks and also for timber, mining, and grazing. The ongoing tension between preserving national lands and profiting from them continues to this day. Public lands are used in two ways. Consumptive use means consuming or using up resources and includes using land for grazing, mining, timber cutting, hunting, and fishing. Non-consumptive use leaves the land pretty much as it is and includes uses such as hiking, backpacking, and ecotourism. The law allows both, and that has caused problems from the beginning. John Muir is known as the father of America's national parks. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, he worked tirelessly to save millions of acres of wilderness and establish national parks around the country. He wrote about his travels in the wild in popular newspaper articles, and his writings inspired many Americans to work to preserve wilderness areas. Muir founded the Sierra Club in 1892 and argued for the creation of 13 national forests in the West. He worked closely with a number of presidents to expand the national parks. He took Presidents Cleveland, Roosevelt, and Taft into the wilderness with him. Muir is responsible for helping to preserve some of America's most beloved national treasures, including the Grand Canyon and Sequoia and Yosemite National Parks. Muir would probably not be surprised by some of the issues that surround our public lands today. For instance, a growing oil shortage has led President George W. Bush to push to expand oil drilling on public lands in Alaska. Should he be allowed to do that in the economic interests of this country? Or is it our duty to preserve one of America's last untouched wildernesses? And what role does a state like Alaska have in the matter? The United States has about 270 million acres of public land not designated as national parks or wildlife refuges. Most of it is out west, an area of our country which was unpopulated for a long time.
Large tracts of the western states are owned by the federal government. In Nevada, the federal government owns 85% of the land. As those states' populations have grown rapidly in the last few years, the federal and state governments have fallen into arguments over who will fund the growth of these states.
States want more control over their destinies, no matter how much federally owned land they contain. And money issues aren't the only problems states have with the federal government. Take Yucca Mountain, Nevada, about 100 miles outside of Las Vegas. The U.S. Department of Energy wants to bury 77,000 tons of radioactive waste inside the mountain.
The residents of Nevada and the local governments have lobbied extensively in Washington to try to keep the nuclear wastes out of their state. However, the federal government needs to store the nuclear waste somewhere, and has settled on the Nevada site.
States argue that the federal government can do what it wants without their input. Other presidents have decided to preserve public land that a state wanted to use, too.
Some presidents have taken land off the table that state and local governments had sought to develop. Both President Carter and President Clinton used a special law to remove lands that were threatened by development from the public domain. They instead created them as national monuments to preserve them for future generations.
Arguments about public land have always been about opposing interests between state and federal needs, between conservationists and business people. In a perfect world, there'd be plenty of land to go around for everyone. That simply isn't the case anymore in the United States. There are limits to our natural resources. More and more often, we will have to decide whether we should profit from our land or protect it. How is public land in the United States used? What factors affect decisions about public land use? The U.S. government owns about 270 million acres of land across the country that it can develop and use for any purpose. What happens when a state government disagrees with how federal land in their state is being used? How might these disagreements be worked out? Imagine your school is holding student council elections. There will be an assembly where candidates can talk about the issues. To be fair, anyone who wants to run should be allowed to speak. But what if 20 people want to be student council president? How about 50? Would you allow everyone to have a turn sharing their opinions? Or would you have some kind of system to cut down on the speeches and make it easier to concentrate on the people who have the best chance of winning? In the United States, we have a two-party system that helps us narrow down the candidates. The Democrats and the Republicans are the two big voting groups in this country. There are two parties. There are other minor parties which are often called third parties. America currently has 5 nationally organized third parties, but most Americans identify themselves as Democrats or Republicans and vote for one of those two parties' candidates. Some people think the two parties stand for very specific things. They say Democrats are more liberal about things like public services for people with lower incomes, and Republicans are more conservative and want to limit government aid. But the truth is, there are many, many different opinions within each party. In fact, candidates within both parties raise issues they feel are important during presidential primaries, the time when voters in different states decide who should run for president from the Democratic or Republican Party. Some people believe that since one of the goals of a primary is to introduce new ideas into the presidential race, allowing third parties into debates is unnecessary. Because the two-party system has been with us since the ratification of the Constitution, many people now take for granted that it is the best way to represent voters. But some people say it is unfair to candidates who aren't members of the Democratic or Republican parties, and that even with the primaries, the system limits new ideas from being presented. Third parties have been responsible for many important ideas that were eventually incorporated into American life. Women's right to vote and child labor laws were championed by third parties. Some people want third-party candidates to debate head-to-head with the two-party candidates in order to have their opinions heard. America stands for a lot of important ideas, but none may be as important as the concept that anyone can run for office. It's important because it means all Americans are equal. Every single one of us has the right to lead this country.
So Jesse Ventura ran for governor in Minnesota and won as the Reform Party candidate. He ran on a platform of good government and clean up Minnesota politics. Third parties in general tend to pick issues that the two major parties are not addressing and run on those. And the ones that are successful are known because they've picked up those issues and brought them to the attention of voters.
It's hard for third-party candidates to win, but they play an important role in presenting specific ideas to the public, such as lowering taxes or changing environmental policy. Often, one of the major parties will adopt ideas raised by third parties as their own. But third-party candidates can still run.
Ross Perot ran as the Reform Party candidate in 1992 against President Bush and Bill Clinton, who won in the end. Perot ran under the Reform Party banner, and the issue there was primarily government reform and the large budget deficit, which was his big issue in his charts, which he showed America. He got about 20% of the vote, and so he drew moderates from both parties on this issue. He didn't win. He drew probably more votes from Bush than from Clinton. He got enough votes that it was the most votes that a third party had gotten since Teddy Roosevelt ran at the beginning of the 20th century.
I was not put on the ballot by either of the two parties. I was not put on the ballot by any PAC money, by any foreign lobbyist money, by any special interest money.
Perot had a lot of public support, and he got to speak in the televised presidential debates. But that doesn't always happen.
So the Commission on Presidential Debates is a nonpartisan organization that organizes the debates every 4 years. They have criteria for appearing in the debates. Usually you have to be getting more than 15% of the vote in order to be invited to debate, so that the two major parties are always included, and only rarely are third parties included. The major consequence of this is that third parties are rarely on the platform. They rarely get their message through. Many voters, in fact most voters, first pay attention every 4 years at the time of the debates. And so if you're not on the platform, you're not going to get your message across, and you're likely not to be a factor in the election.
Some candidates wonder how they can ever win over voters if they don't get to appear in debates. Is there a better way? Not every country has a two-party system where people vote for only one candidate. Australia uses ranked choice voting. That's when voters take the entire list of candidates and put them in order of whom they like best. If there's one candidate who shows up on top of the majority of these lists, he or she wins. But if no one gets more than 50% of the votes, the person who came in last gets crossed off the list. All of his or her votes get moved to the person that was named second on the individual ballots. The votes are tallied again with these additions, and if there's a clear winner, the race is over. If not, they scratch off another candidate from the bottom of the list until a winner is found. Would this model work better in the United States? What if U.S. voters ranked the presidential candidates instead of voting for just one? Ralph Nader, a third-party candidate kept out of the presidential debates in 2004, thinks that ranked choice voting is a better way to go. And, across the country, many college campuses and even some cities are experimenting with the idea. In November of 2004, San Francisco voters made history when they used ranked choice voting in local elections.
Preferential voting or ranked order voting is a method that's supported by a number of people who have a number of different goals. A primary one is to allow candidates who have a different set of maybe more radical or just different set of issue concerns to get on the ballot and have their supporters not feel like they're wasting their vote by voting for these folks. And so that's why it's supported. There are cities like San Francisco these days who are trying it out. And it's got to be said that there's been mixed success. On the one hand, it did bring more candidates out, and it did give many people a sense that they had greater choice than before. The danger of rank order voting, these sorts of methods, is that it usually puts all the candidates on one big ballot together. Oftentimes dozens, or even in some cases hundreds of candidates on a ballot, and that just gets very confusing.
Colleges are also trying the ranked choice system.
Here at MIT, we've been using preferential voting system for quite a while to select our undergraduate leadership. A number of colleges have been contacting us, I think because they believe also that it is the ideal system for selecting people for different offices. It really allows voters to maximize their choice overall. They're allowed to rank all the candidates so that if they're first, second, third, fourth, it keeps going. If they don't end up making it to the final round, you always have like your lower choice there to fall back upon.
Despite the mixed success that cities like San Francisco have had, some younger voters think that change may be in the air.
Certainly when a student goes through a college voting process and they see ranked choice voting, that's a solid algorithm and it seems to work well, and then they go vote in national elections and see they're only allowed one choice, hopefully they wonder, why is this worse than what we had in college? Why can't we change to a more reasonable system?
So, there are other ways of voting that might help level the playing field for third parties. But should minor party candidates still be excluded from presidential debates? Why are presidential debates such a big deal anyway? Can't third party candidates just get their points across in the news? Debates are the one election event geared specifically toward the general public. In a close election year, they can have an enormous impact. Take the nation's first televised debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy back in 1960. It was broadcast on both television and radio. Most of the radio audience thought Nixon won, but the larger television audience thought the handsome, charismatic Kennedy was the winner, and analysts think that this perception played a part in Kennedy's narrow victory in the 1960 elections. Some people also worry that because third-party candidates are often less well-known, they don't get as much news coverage. So, why keep the old two-party debate system at all? Many people argue that the two-party debates give a clearer choice to the voters. During the primaries, issues are supposed to be raised that the public cares about. So why is it necessary for third-party candidates to debate? And some people think that the two-party system helps keep both parties from swinging too far to the left or right. It makes them more moderate. On the other hand, in a two-party system, candidates from the same party are often motivated to run attack campaigns to get people to choose them over their opponents in the primaries. And some people say the candidates stake out only those positions they need to in order to separate themselves from their primary opponents, leaving important issues to third parties. Is there one right way? Probably not. And that means that the debate over debates is likely to continue. Do you think that allowing third-party candidates to participate in debates would significantly affect presidential elections? Why or why not? How do you think ranked choice voting might affect our two-party system? Pop quiz. If you had a choice, would you rather use a key to open the car door or a clicker? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that the clicker is faster. The great thing about technology is that it often replaces old ways of doing things without anyone really caring too much. I mean, is anyone really in love with opening their car doors with a set of keys? But just try and explain to people who like the traditional way of doing things about burning a CD or text messaging. And it's pretty clear that not everyone is ready to go digital. Take electronic voting, or e-voting. Seems like a no-brainer. When people vote electronically in national, state, or local elections, their vote should be easier to count and keep track of. And with the internet, who knows? Maybe one day you could cast a vote from a beach or a mall instead of having to go to a voting center. The convenience of e-voting might even help get more people to vote. But not everyone is convinced that new voting technology is good enough to use around the country, or that we have enough people trained to use it the right way. They're worried that something will go wrong and votes will be lost or miscounted. But those same problems can and do occur even when voters use old-fashioned ways of voting, with paper and pencil or punch card ballots. In the 2000 presidential election, experts believe that between 1.5 and 2 million votes were lost because of faulty equipment and confusing ballots. Anyone who's ever heard the words, "because I said so," knows it's awful not to have a say in your own life. But American voters don't have that problem. We get to choose our president and other representatives who make laws that affect us. Our votes are important, every one of them.
When we go to elect a president, there's really two parts. The more visible part, which you see all the time on the news, is the popular vote, where the candidates canvass and voters eventually in November vote. Now, what they're actually voting for is not the presidential candidates per se, but they're actually voting for electors who vote in something called the Electoral College. And it's those electors who are chosen formally by the voters who then will go in December of every 4 years and actually cast ballots. And it's that Electoral College vote that chooses the president.
The 2000 presidential election between Al Gore and George W. Bush shows why every vote means so much. The election was incredibly close. Al Gore won the popular vote, but George W. Bush won more votes in the Electoral College.
So Florida became a critical state in the 2000 presidential election because, well, first of all, just the popular vote was so close, and it was so close throughout the nation. So when all of the dust had settled on election night, there were a number of states that were won by George Bush, the Republican. Those states gave their electoral votes to him. There were a number of other states that were won by Al Gore, the Democrats. They gave their electoral votes to him. Neither candidate had enough to win a majority in the Electoral College. It all came down to Florida, where Bush, then Gore, then Bush were neck and neck through a 2-month recount.
Most Florida voters used punch card ballots. When voters marked their choices, they were supposed to push a tool called a stylus through a hole next to their candidate's name. But many didn't push the stylus hard enough. The leftover paper, called a hanging chad, was confusing to vote counters. They couldn't tell if these ballots showed votes or not.
Well, in Florida, not only was the vote close, but there were many charges of electoral irregularities throughout the state. And so the Gore campaign not only demanded a recount, but they demanded that certain standards be applied to that recount. The requests were controversial enough, and the Florida election processes were also loose enough that these questions came through all levels of the courts in Florida, then all levels of the courts on the federal side, eventually reaching the U.S. Supreme Court. At the end of the day, the Gore campaign lost all the legal arguments, and George Bush was given Florida, and therefore he was elected president.
Would we be able to avoid election problems if the country started using electronic voting technology? It's hard to say. Some people believe that there will be problems no matter what kind of system we use because of the way our elections are run. In the U.S., Local governments run elections, and they all do it differently. Walking into a voting center in this country is not like walking into a fast food restaurant and seeing people in the same uniform serving the same kind of burger everywhere. How you go about voting in a small town in Vermont may be very different than voting in a big city in California. The federal government isn't very involved in the process of voting at all. Though election centers are supposed to stick to a set of voluntary standards put out by the Federal Election Commission, every state and small town has to figure out not only how it will hold elections, but where people will go to vote and who will run the process. They also have to train everyone who works at a voting center. Problems with voting at the state or local level can obviously have a pretty big impact on the outcome of elections. Would e-voting make a difference? And there are other reasons people are very hesitant to change over to a high-tech voting system. After all the problems in Florida during the 2000 presidential elections, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act in 2002. One of the things the law did was provide about $4 billion to states so that they could upgrade their old voting equipment. But new electronic equipment can be just as tough to use as the old methods. Some reports say there have been as many as 1,100 incidents of e-voting equipment working incorrectly since the Help America Vote Act was passed.
Well, the main problem that's oftentimes raised with electronic voting systems has to do with the nature of the software. It turns out that it's impossible to verify with certainty that the software does what you think it's doing. And so you always have concerns of that sort. In the particular case of voting equipment, in 2003, there was a famous study done at Johns Hopkins University where they actually got the code from one of the most common electronic voting systems, analyzed it, and discovered that not only could you not verify everything, but there were features in it that were especially poor programming. And this led them, many computer scientists, then eventually many rank-and-file citizens to wonder how good these voting machines were really.
During the 2004 election in Broward County, Florida, for example, electronic voting machines started counting backwards because the software could only handle 32,000 voters. When some voters in Georgia tried to vote for one candidate in 2002, the machine would register a vote for their opponent. And that's just problems with recording votes. Counting the votes brings up other problems.
Well, some people are also worried about, in addition to the voting machines themselves, they're also worried about computer hackers getting into the counting equipment that aggregates all these votes from the electronic machines.
The concern is that hackers could gain access to the computer that counts the votes, and they could change election totals without anyone knowing. And there are other outside security risks to consider. In January 2003, Toronto was attempting an experiment in online voting when it was hit by the slammer worm, a computer virus that did about $1 billion worth of damage around the world. But if these security issues can be addressed and remedied, electronic voting could make voting easier for many people, including citizens with disabilities and those who struggle with English.
Well, my biggest concern actually is that the current concerns about electronic machines could actually cut off developments in technology. And I think we always have to remember that these machines are first generation, and that the aspirations of the people who want the electronic machines, the best aspirations, are ones that we all share. And so I worry that technology may not be allowed to meet the aspirations of people, for instance, blind voters who want to cast a ballot without having somebody read the ballot to them. They want a secret ballot, and we should be able to do something for them. And so I hope over the next 10, 20 years we will be able to develop electronic machines that address many of these security concerns that the computer scientists have raised.
Is this country ready to cast all of its votes by computer? Most election experts think there are still too many issues around training, security, and how to cope with any technological problems that might come up with electronic voting to make a major switch from paper ballots right now. Votes are too important to leave to chance. But the more Americans use technology in their everyday lives, the more they tend to expect to use it. More and more Americans complete daily tasks such as paying bills online. They use text messaging and email to stay in touch when they're on the road or away from their office or home. Electronic voting has a lot of advantages. It is convenient, saves time, and is likely more accurate if used correctly and without interference. There doesn't seem to be any question that the issue of e-voting will come up again. It remains to be seen when and how we might begin to cast our votes for a move to this 21st century idea. How might electronic voting systems have prevented the problems with reading and counting votes that occurred during the 2000 presidential election in Florida? Security is very important in elections. What are some security issues surrounding electronic voting, and what are the potential consequences? Do you think these problems could ever be solved? If you've ever had a bad case of the flu, you know that you can't think about anything but how awful you feel while you've got it. Once it's gone, though, you completely forget about it. It's too gross. That's basically how most people think about health care. If you're healthy and you've got insurance, being sick never even crosses your mind. But if you're ill and you don't have coverage, especially if you're really sick, health care is about the only thing on your mind. 1 in 10 kids under 18 have no health insurance. To these kids, a broken arm or a case of the flu are bad enough. When a really bad disease like cancer strikes, the cost of treatment can quickly empty a family's bank account and destroy their finances. And it gets worse after kids leave home. Nearly 30% of young people ages 18 to 24 have no health insurance. This leaves them at risk because they may be unable to pay for a doctor when they really need one. Many industrialized countries in the world provide public health care to all their citizens at no or little cost to the patient, but not the United States. Yet, America spends almost as much on health care as Japan and the United Kingdom combined. In this country, we are responsible for getting our own health care. We pay for it in a variety of ways. Many people get health insurance through work. Job-related health insurance is part of what are called job benefits, because employers pay a large portion of the yearly bill on top of the salary they pay. People who are unemployed or whose jobs don't offer health coverage have to pay for medical care themselves. The government helps some groups out. Medicare covers some medical care for older people, and Medicaid is for low-income families. But medical costs are rising, and everyone is feeling the pinch. For the past 30 years, the cost of health care in the United States has exploded. Health care costs were expected to reach $2 trillion a year by the middle of this decade. In fact, Americans spend about 3.5 times more money on health care than our government spends on national defense, and twice as much as it spends for education.
U.S. health costs are the highest in the world and rising quickly. One of the big reasons is that we don't cap spending. As a result, doctors and hospitals and other caregivers spend like they have a blank check. We see that dramatically with prescription drugs, where spending has quadrupled in the last decade alone.
The higher costs have made health insurance companies charge higher monthly fees for covering workers. Because of these increased fees, lots of companies can no longer afford to offer health benefits to workers, or they are making workers pick up more of the costs.
The average American family gets health insurance coverage through the job, and we spend about $10,000 or $12,000 a year, which has been rising by about 10% a year. The employer typically pays 3/4 of the bill, and the family typically pays about 1/4, and the family share has been going up.
Meanwhile, families without job-related health insurance have to pay the whole $12,000 for insurance on their own, or go without it. While Medicaid and Medicare help low-income families and the elderly, a growing number of middle-class families are having a hard time meeting the high costs of medical care. Even though we currently spend so much on health care, 45 million Americans have no health insurance at all. Lots of people think that the United States government should pass a universal health care bill, which would cover the cost of health care for all citizens, not just poor and elderly Americans. But not everyone thinks that universal health care is a good idea. First of all, it's expensive. Second, Americans like to have freedom of choice. They like to pick their own doctors. With some government plans, you don't have the freedom to choose your own doctor or to request all the treatments you think you may need. Plus, the U.S. is a capitalist country. we believe that private companies should be the ones in charge of the things we buy and use, not the government. And some people think that if the government did take over, it could bring down the quality of the health care we now have. They argue that doctors, drug companies, and hospitals work harder knowing that customers can choose where they want to go. So, is it time to reform health care? And if it is, what would the reform look like? That's a subject that has gotten some politicians into hot water.
I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear.
One important proposal that came out of the Bill Clinton presidency was on health care reform. President Clinton introduced the Health Security Act of 1993. The idea was to guarantee affordable, high-quality health care for all Americans, or universal health care.
The bill promised to cover all Americans, partly by increasing spending by forcing all employers, to provide health insurance coverage. And there were also efforts to control cost by making insurance companies and health maintenance organizations try to compete more by price and by quality. When the plan was first announced, the great majority of Americans favored it.
But some small businesses were worried about the expense of having to pay for their employees' health insurance. And conservatives and health insurance companies were also against the plan. These groups fought hard to stop it from becoming law. A year after the act was proposed, it was abandoned. And our next president, George W. Bush, had different ideas about health care reform, including tax-free medical savings accounts to help families pay for health care.
President George Bush is not actually pursuing universal health care, though he has some small subsidies to try to improve coverage a little bit for some people. President Bush's main focus actually is on trying to contain health care costs, and he wants to do that by stripping away some health insurance coverage to lead families to spend more money out of pocket when they're sick, in hopes that patients will somehow figure out what care they need and what care they don't need, and generally spend money more carefully.
But even people who have some insurance can run into trouble paying their share when a health crisis strikes.
Healthcare costs have been shown to be the biggest or second biggest cause of families declaring bankruptcy. Even when they have health insurance, a very large number of people who declare bankruptcy had insurance but still couldn't pay their health care bills.
Countries with national health systems, such as Canada, often have good health care at a lower cost because they can buy drugs in bulk and cut down on paperwork. On the other hand, patients sometimes wait months for non-emergency care, and citizens pay higher taxes to help cover the costs.
The other wealthy countries of the world spend half what we do, but they take care of everyone and they live longer, even though they smoke more and drink more and exercise less than we do.
So, do those countries whose citizens experts say drink and smoke more and exercise less actually run healthier healthcare systems? And will any of these models work for us? The debate over healthcare is not likely to go away anytime soon, and the issues will only get harder as baby boomers age and people live longer and need more expensive care. Some people have suggested that instead of doing away with our current system completely and moving to a universal healthcare plan or to tax-free medical savings accounts, we might be able to make some adjustments to the system we now have. That could mean lowering the Medicare eligibility age from 65 to 55 and extending the Children's Health Insurance Program cutoff age to cover people until they turn 25. This would end up providing coverage to more Americans. We could also increase the amount of Medicaid funding allowed for low-income families and give it to people who earn more money than the current cutoff figures. We might also be able to offer tax incentives for businesses so that they could provide health coverage to part-time and low-wage workers. And the government could encourage small businesses to band together to get better insurance rates for employees, as President Bush has suggested. There's one thing that everyone seems to agree on. With costs continuing to rise each year, something has got to give. And whatever happens with healthcare in the coming years, it's clear that the issues are complex enough that we won't be able to simply take an aspirin and call the doctor in the morning. Do you think a universal healthcare system could ever work in the United States? Why or why not? An unprecedented number of Americans will retire in the next 10 years and become eligible for Medicare. How might that affect our current healthcare system and the American economy? Have you ever heard the expression, "A house divided against itself cannot stand"? Abraham Lincoln was paraphrasing the Bible when he made that comment in a speech back in 1858. Makes sense. Any math teacher will tell you that when you divide something, you break it apart. The funny thing is, despite Lincoln's words, the government of this country is based on a system that encourages it to become divided. And many people believe that a divided government is better than a unified one. So what do divided government and unified government mean? The President of the United States does not run this country alone. He has to work with members of the U.S. Congress to get things done. Congress is made up of two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. If the majority of the members in each House of Congress are in the same political party as the President, that's a unified government. But that doesn't always happen. A Democratic president might have to work with a Republican-controlled Senate, for example. That's known as a divided government. The recent presidential campaign between George W. Bush and John Kerry brought up lots of talk about red states, mainly Republican, and blue states, or Democratic strongholds. Dividing the country like that feels uncomfortable to many people. It's even made some people ask whether divided governments make it impossible to get laws passed in Washington.
And that was the real message that should have gotten out, and it was on this show where the best point of all was made.
Everywhere you go these days, you hear strong opinions. On one side, the conservative messages that are supposed to appeal to people in the red states. And on the other, liberal messages that blue state residents are supposed to believe.
75% of all Americans on the minimum wage, my friends, are teenagers in their first job.
Of course, nothing is really that black and white, or blue and red in this case. Despite what radio commentators, newspaper editors, and bloggers might say.
It's important when you want to pass a big law in Congress that some Democrats and some Republicans, a portion of each, ultimately come to some kind of agreement. Congress is about compromise, and if Democrats and Republicans aren't willing to compromise, it's unlikely you'll get big legislation.
Without these compromises, Congress gets gridlocked and nothing gets done. That was the big fear when Democrat Bill Clinton was re-elected as president in 1996. The majority of representatives in Congress were Republicans, led by conservative Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. It didn't look like the two sides would ever agree, but these fears were never realized.
Clinton obtains, in some ways, more legislation in his second term than he does in his first, which is ironic because in the first term there's a moment when Democrats control Congress. But one of the things Clinton does is he starts to compromise more with the Republican Congress in his second term, and the Republicans start to work a little more with Clinton, even though they don't like him very much.
The president also used the presidential veto, the power to reject a bill, and he used it a lot. From 1995 to 2000, he vetoed 35 bills and threatened to veto about 100 more. Republican leaders challenged 11 of the 35, but only managed to override the president once.
The veto was very important for Bill Clinton in trying to kind of calm down Republicans in terms of what their demands were. That was his biggest negotiating tool. The president has the veto, and he used that in the budget wars with the Republicans to force them to move a little bit to the center on the budget, just as they forced President Clinton to move a little bit to the center on their issues. And that was part of how ultimately we reached compromise during that second term.
As important as the presidential veto and compromise are, a divided government also benefits from one other thing, a healthy economy. Traditionally, a divided government works better in times of prosperity, such as during President Clinton's second term. That's because lawmakers have fewer tough decisions to make about cutting programs and spreading limited dollars around. Decisions that tend to split politicians along party lines. President Clinton found a way to keep things moving when faced with a divided government. But wouldn't it simply have been better to have one unified government? That's what they do in other countries, such as Great Britain. Back when the framers were hammering out a constitution, a house that could be divided seemed like a very good idea because it was a built-in system of checks and balances that prevented any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. So, does that make a unified government a bad thing? By the middle of Republican George W. Bush's first term as president, Republicans held a majority of seats in both houses of Congress, creating a unified government. Many people worried that this one-party control of the Senate, the House, and the presidency might leave some Americans without a voice in Washington. But in earlier times, people often considered a unified government to be a better government. When Republicans took control of Congress after the elections of 1946, for example, some representatives actually asked Democratic President Harry S. Truman to step down in order to create a unified government.
The Republicans in Congress made things hard for President Truman. They made it hard to pass health care. They made it hard to pass a lot of domestic programs. And in turn, Truman became more vocal and more critical and more aggressive in attacking the Congress. And that's often the situation you get when we have divided government in America.
Unified governments are usually easier on presidents. More of their laws get passed. That's certainly what George W. Bush found in his first term.
President Bush benefited from a unified government. What a unified government allows a president to do is push through legislation quickly and forcefully. And President Bush was able to push through a historic tax cut in 2001, and he had solid support from the Republicans, even though Democrats didn't really agree with what was going on. And when he launched the war against Iraq, it was a lot easier for him to do it because the Republicans were so together on this issue. They stuck together and they worked with the president to push that through. So it helped him move things quickly.
Every nation.
But just because a president's party controls Congress doesn't mean every senator or representative from his party will always agree with him. Just ask the candidates in a presidential primary debate. The president still has to work with members of Congress to forge agreements and build consensus. Our system of government is meant to represent as many different people and opinions as possible. And the best governments are those that build support among both Democrats and Republicans. So, what do Americans want? A recent national poll found a growing number of Americans, about 1/3, want a divided government. Some say this means that more Americans are worried that our political parties have moved too far to the left and to the right, leaving out the people in the middle. It's good to be true to your core values and beliefs, but at what point does this become a problem? Bickering between political parties can bring down a whole government. President Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat, took office after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, but his lack of interest in punishing ex-Confederate soldiers and his vetoing of a number of bills that would have given increased civil rights to freed slaves angered many Republicans, and ultimately may have led to Johnson's impeachment. Can a house divided ever be stronger than a unified house? It all depends on whether the two sides are willing to reach across the divide. Why did the framers of the Constitution create a system where a divided government is possible? What kinds of strategies have political leaders used for lawmaking during times of divided government? How might these strategies differ in a unified government? Lots of people tend to think of the President of the United States as being similar to the head of a big corporation, in charge of everything that goes on in this country. But that's not really true. The President is the head of the executive branch of government, and the powers of the President, or executive powers, are laid out in Article 2 of the Constitution. The President's job description, if you want to call it that, includes a role in national security, how the legislature and judicial arm of government work, and the administration of the government. One of the most important roles of the President is Commander-in-Chief of our armed services. He can send troops overseas without declaring war, and he can call the National Guard into federal service. But if he wants to declare war officially, he needs the approval of Congress. The President can recommend legislation to Congress, but he can't write any laws. If he wants to submit a law, he needs to get a member of Congress to do it for him. But even though he can't write laws, he has the power to keep proposals from being made into law with the presidential veto. The President isn't a judge, but he can appoint justices to the Supreme Court, the most powerful court in the country, whenever there is a court vacancy during a presidency. These 9 judges are responsible for interpreting federal laws. The president can also grant pardons to people convicted of federal crimes. One controversial executive power the president has is known as executive privilege. Executive privilege is all about information. What kind of information the president and executive branch can keep to themselves for reasons such as protecting national security, and what information the public, including Congress, has a right to know. But nowhere in the Constitution do we actually see the words executive privilege. So what does it really mean? The president's duties are clearly defined in Article 2 of the Constitution. The Constitution makes it clear that no person, including the president, is above the law. But presidents sometimes argue that not everything they know should be made public, even to members of Congress. That's what happened with President George Washington and the Jay Treaty.
President Washington in 1796 got into a conflict with the House of Representatives. He had recently negotiated a treaty with the British, whereby the British paid Americans for losses during the Revolution and agreed to remove certain troops. And many people were upset with the treaty. They thought they'd given too much away to the British. And members of the House of Representatives want to see documents relating to that treaty, and President Washington says no. He says he doesn't have to give documents to the House because treaties are ratified by the Senate, and he sets a precedent for what we know today as executive privilege, where the president can withhold information on the basis of national security.
President Washington argued that only the Senate approves treaties, so the House of Representatives didn't need the information. He gave the documents to the Senate, but wouldn't share them with the House.
Americans have always been quite suspicious about executive privilege. There's often the idea that politicians and presidents are really trying to cover something up rather than withhold information for national security purposes.
Can executive privilege be used as a way for a president and his staff to get away with breaking the law? Some people worry that it can. In 1974, President Richard M. Nixon was told he had to turn over Oval Office tapes and written records related to a criminal investigation of a break-in at the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. But Nixon claimed executive privilege.
The Supreme Court ordered President Nixon to turn over tapes that had been made in the Oval Office, tapes that many people thought would explain to Americans what really happened at Watergate. President Nixon had initially refused to turn over the tapes and some other material. The court instructed him to do it. A few weeks later, he turned over the material, and soon after, he resigns from the presidency.
Is executive privilege even necessary? Recent presidents have used it to prevent their top advisors from testifying before Congress during a number of very controversial events. In addition to Nixon using it during Watergate, Ronald Reagan invoked executive privilege during the Iran-Contra scandal, and Bill Clinton claimed it during the Lewinsky scandal. In the middle of an inquiry conducted by the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks on the United States on September 11th, George W. Bush prevented the National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice from testifying, claiming executive privilege. What do presidents have to hide anyway? Of course, all presidents are concerned about releasing information that might put our national security at risk. But George Washington might also have argued that executive privilege upholds a very important idea written right into the Constitution. Separation of powers was designed to prevent too much power from being concentrated in any one branch of government, the presidency, Congress, or judicial arm. A president who openly shares every decision would take away from the system of checks and balances.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
The guidelines for executive privilege and how it's interpreted today go back to the days of Watergate. In 1974, the Supreme Court decided that although presidents have a right to quote confidential presidential communications, if these communications are needed for a potential criminal trial, they have to be handed over.
President Clinton invoked executive privilege 4 times. and President Reagan had done so about 3 times. Executive privilege becomes an area of controversy during the Clinton years. When Kenneth Starr, the independent prosecutor, is investigating President Clinton, he claims that the president is withholding information that he has to turn over about this investigation into his affair with an intern.
Independent prosecutor Kenneth Starr argued that the very fact that President Clinton claimed executive privilege in this instance was an abuse of power. So, exactly when is executive privilege okay to use, and who can claim it? That's not always clear. During the Clinton administration, First Lady Hillary Clinton argued that she was covered by executive privilege during the Whitewater real estate scandal. The courts rejected her claim.
In 2002, Vice President Cheney argued that the vice president could withhold information on the basis of executive privilege. Democrats wanted information about a secret group he had convened to write the oil laws of the nation involving energy, and Cheney said that he didn't have to turn that over, that this was secret information, and this became an area of contention.
The Supreme Court ended up refusing to order the vice president to turn over his secret records, but they kept the case alive by sending it back to the lower courts. It's not clear how court decisions on future executive privilege cases will go. What is apparent is that the debate over executive privilege and the power of the presidency isn't going to end anytime soon.
Executive privilege has become an area of controversy since Watergate because it's become a symbol of presidential power. So often when we're fighting about a specific case or moment of executive privilege, did a president have the right to withhold information or not, it's not just a debate about that president, it's a debate about the presidency. How much power should the president have in the United States, and what obligations does the president have to Congress, to the courts, and to citizens?
The idea that government should be transparent, meaning citizens are able to ask and get answers about how specific decisions are made, is one that really defines our country. That's what freedom of the press is all about, too. We want to be able to ask questions and get straight answers from our leaders about what they're doing. But few would argue that there are times when opening up the Oval Office puts security at risk. President George W. Bush invoked executive privilege for the first time in his administration to block a congressional committee. It was trying to review documents about a decades-long scandal involving the FBI and its misuse of mob informants. Though it was an old case, would turning over these documents somehow have put FBI agents or these informants at risk? That's a valid question. Still, the President of the United States is rightly seen as the most powerful person in the world. The Founding Fathers felt it was critical we never forget that even the most powerful among us must be held accountable for their actions. In what ways did the framers of the Constitution try to balance the powers of the presidency with the rights of the people to know what their government is doing? Given the threat of global terrorism today, do you think we should broaden executive powers for the president and his senior staff? Why or why not? You know that saying, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country? John F. Kennedy may not have been talking about taxes when he said that, but he sure could have been. The minute you start earning money in the United States, you're going to have to start paying some of it in taxes, and many people think that's not fair. But government pays for lots of important services that we use, everything from highways to schools. They do this with the money they bring in by taxing 3 things: what people earn, what people buy, and what people have. The biggest percentage of the money used by the federal government comes from what we earn. So on the very first paycheck you receive, you'll see that a portion of it has been taken out under an area called federal withholding. Federal taxes pay for lots of things, including medicine for seniors, running the federal government, and paying salaries to soldiers. The state government gets a small part of your earnings too. States tax your income, what you earn, and what you buy, usually with a sales tax. Not every state has a sales tax, but most do. State taxes pay for state highways and state police, welfare and health care benefits. Finally, your local government relies almost entirely on taxing property and wealth in order to fund all the things that it has to pay for, such as school buildings and snow removal, or new fire equipment for your community. How does the tax system affect you directly? The income tax that individual people pay makes up about 5 times the amount of taxes that come from corporations, so it's critical for running this country. So where does your money go? Melissa has a summer job as a lifeguard at the YMCA. She earns $7.50 an hour.
I usually work 40 hours a week and I take home $300 before taxes. I put half of the money in the bank and then the other half I spend like when I go out with my friends or to the mall or to the movies, and then the money that I put in the bank I'm saving for a car or to go to college.
When Melissa started working at the Y, she had to fill out a W-4 form. The W-4 form helps Melissa's employer take out the right amount of federal income tax from her paychecks. A portion of her paycheck will also go to state income tax. The U.S. uses the pay-as-you-earn tax system. You don't pay taxes unless you're working, and the more money you make, the larger the percentage of your pay that goes towards taxes. Melissa has state and federal income tax taken out of her check each pay period. The money collected for the state pays for things like unemployment insurance in case Melissa loses her job. Federal taxes go to the Internal Revenue Service, the agency in charge of paying the nation's bills.
I usually take home $273 after state and federal tax. And I don't think it's fair because if we're already paying sales tax in our state, then what's the point of them taking out more money? But in a way, I guess it's good because it helps to build schools in our community and it helps with health care benefits for other people.
Many people are frustrated that so much of their paychecks are spent on taxes. They think the government spends too much money. Other people disagree with some of the specific things that our taxes pay for, such as military spending or Medicaid. The federal government actually spends money on lots of different things. The federal government operates many programs for its citizens. Among the largest are Social Security and Medicare. The way we fund Social Security, which is basically a retirement fund for working Americans, and Medicare, which covers medical expenses for seniors, has been debated a lot in the news recently. That's because these two areas alone make up about 1/3 of the tax spending in this country. Another big portion of federal spending is for national defense. We also have to pay off interest on the debt that America carries, the same way you pay interest on a car loan or a credit card debt. And simply running the country takes money too. Today, government taxes income, property, and wealth to pay off the deficit, run government agencies, support the poor and elderly, and continue social services. Do we really need all this taxation to keep the country running? One of the first things George W. Bush did as president was to cut taxes. The Economic Growth and Tax Relief and Reconciliation Act of 2001 reduces the amount of taxes Americans pay over time. Even so, we paid about $1 trillion in income taxes in 2004. Throughout our history, the U.S. has gone back and forth on the issue of taxes. The federal government collected its first income tax in 1863. It was a progressive tax. That means the more you earn, the more you pay. A few years later, this was replaced with a flat tax, where everyone is charged the same rate. And a few years after that, taxes were abolished completely.
In 1913, Congress passed the 16th Amendment to our Constitution. The 16th Amendment established the federal income tax. Several years later, during World War II, the federal government began to withhold taxes from people's paychecks for the first time. These taxes were needed to help finance the war effort during World War II.
War and taxes have always been linked. In fact, in the 1940s and 1950s, the top tax rates were 90% because of World War II and the Korean War.
Well, during the Iraq War, the federal government has been spending about $1 billion a week to finance the effort. During the past few years, the federal government has moved to reduce taxes, not raise them, and this has led to a large and growing budget deficit. Now, some people would argue that because the benefits of a war accrue to future generations, that it may well make sense not to tax people today, but to spread the tax burden out into the future. Yet, In most historical cases, governments have raised taxes, at least somewhat, during war efforts.
Some Americans think we should repeal the 16th Amendment and replace the income tax with a national sales tax. Others believe we should do away with the progressive income tax and go back to the flat tax. Are taxes really necessary? It depends on the kind of society Americans want to have. There will probably always be some people who think taxes need to be changed. But it might be interesting to see how Melissa would fare in a country with a different tax system. According to recent figures, America is just about at the bottom of the list of developed nations when it comes to the amount people pay in federal taxes. U.S. citizens pay about 1/4 of their income in taxes. In Sweden, half of a citizen's income goes toward taxes. That's twice the amount we pay in the U.S. What would Melissa get for the extra taxes she'd pay in Sweden? Well, taxes there cover some pretty nice benefits, such as free medical care, free university schooling, and 32 paid days off every year. But Melissa might not be able to afford to go anywhere on her vacation if that much were taken out of her paycheck. So there's good and bad in both systems. Compared to other countries, Americans don't really pay that much in taxes, and tax money is used for very important things in our country. Still, it doesn't hurt to ask, could our tax money be better spent? Do we really need all the government services our taxes pay for? Are there other ways to pay for them? But until we come up with another plan, as the saying goes, nothing will be as certain as death and taxes. The U.S. has enacted or considered enacting a progressive tax, a flat tax, and a national sales tax to pay for the services it provides. What are some of the arguments for and against each of these systems? Americans pay much less in taxes than many other countries' citizens do. However, we receive fewer benefits from our government than citizens of higher taxed countries. Do you think Americans get the most for their tax dollars? Why or why not? If you're an 18-year-old guy, you or someone you know may have already registered with the Selective Service. What does that mean? Selective Service refers to one way the U.S. gets soldiers for our military forces. The law requires all American men to fill out a form registering them with Selective Service when they turn 18. This puts their names into a national database of potential soldiers, but they are not forced to enter the military. That's because today in this country we have what's known as a volunteer military. Everyone who is in the military now had the choice to sign up. That hasn't always been the case. This is a lottery ticket. Most people think of the lottery and visions of money float through their heads. But for men and women who grew up during the Vietnam War, the lottery referred to the military draft. A draft is a system that's used to bring additional soldiers, called conscripted soldiers, into the military when there aren't enough. So when a guy registers for Selective Service, he submits his name for any present or future drafts. The problem during the Vietnam War was that many young people believed the war was wrong. They refused to fight for a cause that they were against, but the military still needed soldiers. So, beginning in December of 1969, 18-year-olds received a lottery number based on the day they were born. That number was used to determine who would be conscripted into the Army first. If you were a young man in 1969 and you were born on September 14th, you were number 1 in the lottery. The United States has gone back and forth on the issue of the draft at different times in our history. President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 and created the country's first peacetime draft. Between 1948 and 1973, young men were drafted to fill any vacancies in the armed forces that couldn't be filled by people who'd enlisted voluntarily. In 1973, the draft ended and the U.S. became an all-volunteer military. 2 years later, the registration requirement was dropped too. But when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1980, President Jimmy Carter brought back Selective Service registration, which continues to this day, though there is no draft at the moment. Some people think a volunteer military is better than a military that includes people who really don't want to serve. They argue that morale is higher and the quality of soldiers is better when recruits want to be there. Other people believe that a draft would reinstate a sense of national service. They think that it's part of our duty as citizens to be willing to protect this country and its beliefs. Not even the men and women who have served agree. There are about 26 million veterans alive today from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the 2 Gulf Wars. But not everyone entered the military the same way. Take Govt Scenarios, a World War II Navy veteran who served 6 years in the regular Navy and 33 years in the reserves.
Definitely it was Pearl Harbor, it was attacked at Pearl Harbor, and I thought that was my duty to help us with the revenge of that particular event. And I had a business at that time, but I employed 5 people, but I closed my business and I joined the Navy for that particular purpose.
I finished 2 years of college, and at that time it was a 2-year course and stuff, and I was considering going on to do more, and during that time, within a 6-month period, that the draft came up and I got my draft notice. So it was time to show up for the service.
The way you enter the military doesn't necessarily determine how well you perform as a soldier.
When I was in the service in Vietnam and so forth, I went along with everything, and I even performed well and stuff, and became squad leaders and this and that and stuff, and moved up in rank. So you do what you have to do for the service.
And even those who served willingly once may not always believe that war is the best solution.
Now, in the present situation, I don't think that we had any reason to go into Iraq. I think the information that was received by the authorities was not sufficient enough to warrant this type of warfare.
Many people feel that Americans must be willing to pay the ultimate price for their country.
I love the United States, and I tell people that if you could travel abroad and live one day in the shoes of someone from another country, when you got off the plane coming back into the United States, you would literally bend over, kiss the ground, and thank the Lord that you were born a U.S. citizen. You can't help but grow an intense appreciation for being a United States citizen when you get to see the way some people in other countries are living and the lack of freedom that we take for granted by birthright. It's an incredible experience to know the difference by being on the other side of the fence. And I have an ingrained appreciation. I believe that there was a part of me that when I joined the military, the U.S. Army in the beginning, I felt patriotic, but that has grown, and it's not what some people would typify, oh, you've been brainwashed. I believe that my love for my country has just grown over the years because I have been able to nurture an appreciation for what many Americans take for granted. They have no idea how lucky they are to have been born an American.
Today, many Americans feel we face one of the most difficult battles of all, a war on terror, and we need increased resources and manpower to fight it. U.S. soldiers now in the service made a choice to join up, but there are many critics who believe our present system is unfair. They say the all-volunteer military has led to a higher percentage of minorities and people with lower incomes serving their country, letting wealthier citizens off the hook. Others point to the fact that some servicemen and women who joined willingly have served the terms they signed up for and are ready to get out, but can't. They call this a backdoor draft and say that because there aren't enough volunteers, the government is making soldiers serve longer than they should. If the soldiers now unable to leave the military were released, replacements would have to be found. And that could force the country to return to a full-blown draft. America hasn't had a draft in a long time. But even though we don't technically have a draft today, many people believe that the U.S. military is using a backdoor draft to keep up the supply of soldiers. That's because our armed forces have issued stop-loss orders that prevent soldiers from leaving the service after their tours of duty are up.
Well, some people have referred to stop-loss orders as a backdoor draft, referring to the fact that once people want to get out and are not allowed to get out, their service is essentially involuntary. It is important to note, however, that when people enlist, it is a clear term of their service that their service can be extended beyond a certain date. So it is something that the Pentagon always reserves the right to do, although it's not customarily done.
How can we fix this? Some Democrats and Republicans have proposed reinstating the draft. The head of the Selective Service himself says he'd like to register women for the draft and extend the upper eligibility age from 25 to 34, allowing people from ages 18 to 34 to be drafted. But, so far, Congress hasn't passed the draft. In 2004, the House voted 402 to 2 to defeat a proposed draft bill. Still, the draft is on the minds of many.
Well, there's an interesting tension existing now. Just recently, in the last several months, the armed services are failing to meet their recruitment quotas. Pressure is being put on the personnel resources. Stop-loss orders have been enacted. So there are pressures for more people, but at the same time, I don't think a draft could be reintroduced without very serious public scrutiny of the foreign policy of the United States more generally. So to say, we have overseas commitments, we need more troops, would lead people to question whether those commitments were prudent and in the national interest in the first place. I think a draft would still be a very significant and potentially a very divisive measure.
One solution would be to require every citizen to serve in some way. A national service program that would take some of the burden off our military. But there are stumbling blocks.
The idea of compulsory service has actually gained a wide variety of supporters in the last decade or so. There are some pretty important obstacles, though. First of all, it would be expensive. You'd have to compensate people in some way. Second, in terms of people serving in the armed forces, it's interesting that the armed forces has not been an enthusiastic supporter of the draft in the last generation. Until very recently, they were meeting their recruitment quotas, and they were meeting them with people who were very qualified, well-educated, and very capable.
Still, not everyone believes that the United States is ever going to reinstate the draft. They think it goes against the very nature of our country.
I'm familiar with the draft because I was a kid when they drafted many of the young people into the Vietnam War. But I don't believe in the future that even though there's talk and there's speculation about a draft, I don't believe that the United States government will ever bring that back into effect. It doesn't do us any good to represent freedom on all plains or plateaus if you're going to force your people to do something that they don't want to do. It goes against what we have worked so hard to incorporate into the theme of world peace.
Will we reinstate the draft anytime soon? President George W. Bush has said he opposes it, and Congress has already voted against it. But if we did bring back the draft, it would take a few steps before draftees would actually be placed into military service. Congress and the President would have to reauthorize the draft. We'd have to reinstate the lottery system, draftees would have to be screened, and appeal boards would have to be put in place. So, it appears unlikely that we'll see young men being drafted in the very near future. Still, no one knows what that future might bring. As the great statesman Winston Churchill once said, "Never, never, never believe any war will be smooth and easy, or that anyone who embarks on the strange voyage can measure the tides and hurricanes he will encounter." The United States needs well-trained soldiers, and today it has a shortage of volunteers. Do you think the draft should be reinstated? If so, should any groups, such as women, be exempt? Many countries require that all citizens serve their country while they are still young. Do you believe that all Americans should be trained as soldiers? If not, should they complete some kind of alternative national service? The death penalty is one of the most difficult issues facing Americans today. The death penalty, also known as capital punishment, is a legal sentence that allows a nation to execute criminals for certain crimes. There are many, many arguments for and against the death penalty. In the end, some of the arguments simply come down to personal morals. Those who support it say that brutal crimes and terrorist acts must be punished, and that the punishment of death will actually stop other people from committing horrible crimes. People who oppose the death penalty argue that there is always the risk of executing someone who is innocent, and that a nation that itself allows the execution of criminals can't really claim that it is against murder. People on both sides of the issue may have strong religious beliefs that influence how they feel about it. More than half the countries in the world have now abolished the death penalty in law or practice. 40 countries have abolished the death penalty for all crimes in the past 15 years. But in the United States, 38 of the 50 states have a death penalty law, as does the U.S. military. Even so, statistically, the death penalty is very rarely carried out in this country. There are more than 3,400 prisoners under the sentence of death on death row in the United States. In 2004, 59 prisoners were executed, and since the death penalty was reinstated in the 1970s, 944 people have been executed. The U.S. Supreme Court recently ruled that the Constitution forbids the execution of killers who were under 18 when they committed their crimes, overturning a practice that had been allowed in 19 states. The court has also banned the death penalty for the mentally disabled. Since 1973, 119 prisoners have been released from death row because of new evidence. In many of these cases, DNA evidence played a big role in helping to free the inmate. Now, DNA is the material that makes up our genes. All people have a unique DNA pattern, a sort of genetic fingerprint. Newly developed DNA tests are now being used to retest old evidence to make sure the right people have been convicted. For many people, both for and against the death penalty, the idea that an innocent person could be put to death is unacceptable. On television, criminal defense lawyers are amazingly good at getting wrongly convicted criminals freed. We hear a lot about DNA evidence clearing the innocent by proving that they could not possibly have committed a crime, that, in fact, a different person was responsible. But in real life, wrongful convictions are not always overturned.
In the past decade or so, DNA testing has proved to be a very important tool for determining who's really guilty and who's really innocent. The problem with DNA testing, however, is that it reaches a very small number of the kinds of errors that actually occurred. Somebody who murders somebody at a distance with a rifle shot leaves no DNA evidence to be discovered. And in case after case, it turns out that the DNA evidence that was available was just sheer luck, and it might not have been available if the crime had taken a different pattern.
Still, many legal experts believe that new technologies should be used to reanalyze old evidence in death penalty cases. In fact, Democratic and Republican lawmakers worked together to pass a law called the Innocence Protection Act that guarantees that all convicted offenders are given the opportunity to prove their innocence through DNA testing. But critics of the death penalty point out that DNA evidence, such as a murderer's hair or blood, isn't available in many crimes, and they say that relying on other evidence to sentence someone to death is very troubling.
Most criminal convictions depend upon eyewitness testimony for burglary, robbery, rape, and other crimes. It's the eyewitness, often the victim, who is the one that gives the information that the police rely upon. But in the case of the crime of murder, the best eyewitness is the victim. And so it turns out that research has shown that the principal cause of error in criminal cases involving homicide is the way in which the witnesses are not eyewitnesses, but they are prosecution witnesses, jailhouse snitches, who will lie to the authorities in order to make a better deal for themselves. This is one of the troubling peculiarities of the testimony that convicts so many people and sentences them to death. The unreliability of that kind of testimony is particularly prominent where a deal can be struck between the prisoner, the offender, and the authorities.
And many death penalty opponents have serious moral issues with the law. Should a country that says it's against murder also have a provision for killing citizens, for instance? Many religions teach that killing is wrong, period. And many people who are against the death penalty also point to the fact that there are a disproportionate number of people on death row who are poor and who are people of color.
The death penalty is supposed to be the device by means of which we give people what they deserve when what they deserve is death, having committed a murder. It turns out in practice that we can't do that, and the statistics show that we don't do it.
Of course, no one wants to see an innocent person put to death. But the Supreme Court set a high constitutional standard for the death penalty back in the 1970s. Support of the death penalty in the United States has dipped occasionally, but it remains very high. About 70% of Americans still believe it is a good idea. Some supporters believe it is a deterrent to crime, that a criminal who knows he may die for his behavior will be less likely to commit the crime. Others think the death penalty helps the families of victims with the emotional trauma of losing someone they love. In 1996, the United States Congress passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, a major change in how quickly terrorists and other criminals can be put to death. The new law was put in place for people like Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh, whose attack killed 168 people and was considered the worst terrorist act in our country until 9/11. The new law expanded the death penalty to include additional crimes, and it also sped up the appeals process, the legal process in which a case is brought back to court to see if the decision can be overturned. The death penalty has an extensive, and some say expensive, appeals process, but it was put in place for the very reason that it would protect the innocent from ending up on death row. But anyone who has lost a loved one in a violent crime knows that victims need protecting too. You may have heard this expression from the Bible, an eye for an eye. Punishment by death, the death penalty, was the accepted way to treat murderers for hundreds of years. The more modern attitude about the death penalty didn't begin until the late 1600s. Prior to that, it was acceptable to put people to death for a wide range of crimes. In some states, the list included not only murder, but also crimes such as adultery and witchcraft. But in 1682, under William Penn's Great Act, Pennsylvania ruled that only murder and treason could be punishable by death. That same notion of justice is in evidence today.
The most important reason for preserving the death penalty as an option for juries to impose on the perpetrators of particularly vicious murders is that the death penalty is a means of expressing society's sense of justice. Those who have been victimized by murderers, those who have lost a husband or wife, a son or daughter, a brother or sister, like, let's say, the victims of the 9/11 terrorists or the Washington snipers, have every right to expect that government will at least dispose of those murderers' lives in the way that they have disposed of those beloved, of the family members and friends of the murdered victims.
Today, the only crimes considered capital offenses in which the death penalty can be used are murder, treason, and terrorist acts. In fact, terrorism makes some people rethink the death penalty completely. In a poll taken shortly after the Oklahoma City bombings in 1995, 1 out of 5 respondents who opposed the death penalty said they'd support the execution of a defendant convicted of a terrorist attack.
The rise of terrorist events directed against American citizens in recent years, especially the horror of September 11th, has, I think, caused many Americans who previously had reservations about the death penalty to rethink their position. Nothing can ever compensate the family members and loved ones of the victims of 9/11 and other terrorist incidents. But should our government not at least be able to say that when we capture Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of those terrorist acts, and others plotting terrorist actions against us, that those guilty of murdering innocent American civilians will be given the ultimate penalty by our government? Can we not expect that much of any decent government?
Supporters of the death penalty believe that some crimes, such as terrorist attacks, deserve the harshest punishment that can be handed out. But the death penalty is not just for those who are convicted.
I favor the retention of a death penalty as an option for juries to impose on first-degree murderers for three reasons. Deterrence, the only sure means of incapacitation, that is, so the murderer can't murder again, and above all, as an expression of the community's sense of justice.
The United States is one of the few countries that still has the death penalty. 84 countries around the world have abolished the death penalty for all crimes. Of course, it can be argued that Americans need the death penalty because we have a higher violent crime rate than most other industrialized countries. Others might argue back that if we say it's wrong to kill, the death penalty is wrong too. The fact is, there are persuasive arguments on both sides of the issue. But regardless of our personal, legal, or religious feelings about capital punishment, as a nation, it is our duty to make sure our legal system never puts an innocent person to death for a crime he or she did not commit. How have scientific advances, like testing DNA evidence, changed the way some Americans view the death penalty? How has terrorism affected people's views on this issue? Do you think it is possible in America today to ensure that our justice system will never put an innocent person to death? Why or why not? The events of September 11, 2001 changed this nation forever. The attacks also changed the law. Within 6 weeks of the terror attack on this country, Congress had passed the Patriot Act. The legislation, whose full name is the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism, or USA Patriot Act of 2001, was passed in Washington with almost no debate. That's pretty much unheard of in politics today. Even when politicians agree on the basics of a law, there's usually a lot of arguing and deal-making until a compromise is reached. But right after 9/11, Congress felt it was urgent to pass legislation that could prevent any impending attacks. Some critics claim Congress was in such a hurry that many representatives didn't even read the act. Others say that there was no time to argue in the midst of a national crisis. When the legislation was introduced, Attorney General John Ashcroft gave Congress just 1 week in which to pass the bill without making any changes. The law was hundreds of pages long and extremely complex. It covered everything from immigration to wiretaps to computer fraud. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Democrat Patrick Leahy of Vermont, convinced the Justice Department to agree to some changes. But, worried about further terrorist attacks, Congress pushed the bill through without making any amendments. When the bill moved over to the Senate, only one senator, Russ Feingold of Wisconsin, objected to it. The Patriot Act was signed into law on October 26, 2001.
Good morning and welcome to the White House. Today we take an essential step in defeating terrorism while protecting the constitutional rights of all Americans.
America has always tried to protect its citizens, but sometimes this need for security competes with the wish to protect our individual rights. The Patriot Act shifts the balance away from personal freedoms and towards national security.
The Patriot Act was designed to close some of the loopholes in the law that made it difficult to prosecute terrorists. So now, under the Patriot Act, federal prosecutors can share information and receive information from intelligence agents, local and state law enforcement agents, so that the information can be shared and it can be, more readily available to prosecute suspected terrorists in America.
The Act authorizes investigations of private computers and businesses without proof of a crime. It allows more general, roving wiretaps of suspected terrorists where the government can listen in on any communication anywhere. The government can also conduct searches and even hold people without explaining why. These so-called sneak and peek tactics have opponents of the Patriot Act up in arms.
Well, under the Patriot Act and other laws that were passed after September 11th, the government can detain people. It can hold them under immigration charges indefinitely. And so there's been a lot of activity by the government that I think, questions sort of how far we're willing to go to preserve our security. And it's a debate that we're having still a couple years after September 11th. What kind of country are we, and what kind of country are we willing to become to make ourselves safer?
The first 10 amendments of the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights protects our civil liberties, personal freedoms such as freedom of speech and religion. They guarantee the right to a trial by jury and protect us from unreasonable searches and seizures.
It's important for every American to read the Patriot Act because the Patriot Act says a lot, and it says a lot about criminal investigations. But in this debate about civil liberties and national security and how much are we willing to give up to be safe, there's a lot of other activities and other powers that the government has that aren't actually in the Patriot Act. So we need to know, actually, it's important to remember what the Patriot Act actually says and other things, for example, detentions or the interviewing of Muslim groups that have gotten a lot of criticism, but that those aren't part of the Patriot Act.
Despite the hurried beginnings of the USA Patriot Act and concerns by civil rights groups, most Americans are in favor of the law. According to a national poll taken 2 years after the attacks, 75% of Americans were not worried that the USA Patriot Act violated their civil rights, and around one-half said that the act is about right. But there are groups, and even some courts, who now say the law is not about right, and in fact, parts of it are very wrong. They wonder, are our civil liberties being sacrificed to fight the war on terrorism? And if they are, is our security worth it? Different people have different answers to that. Let's look at how the law could affect you personally. Section 507 is the disclosure of educational records provision of the law. With it, the U.S. Attorney General may obtain your private educational records, such as grades, private medical information, and even the names of student organizations you joined. Section 215 allows the government to get a list of the library books you took out too. If you're not a citizen, Section 411 says you could be deported if someone you know, like a relative or neighbor, is a terrorist, even if you had no idea that they were. When casting a wide net to catch an unknown enemy, like a terrorist, a law that allows us to look everywhere without hesitation makes sense to many people. But now that the Patriot Act has been in effect for a few years, is it time to back away from some parts of the law? It's impossible to overestimate the effect that 9/11 had on this country. We were under attack, and we didn't know what was coming next. Our leaders wanted to act quickly to protect us. But, looking back, some people say the Patriot Act may have gone too far.
The ACLU and other groups have been very critical of the Patriot Act. They feel like it gives too many powers to the government. They also feel like it's being targeted against Arab and Muslim groups. I think groups like the ACLU are also concerned that as we get further away from September 11th, that the Patriot Act is being used in all sorts of other ways unrelated to terrorism, that the government is just using these new powers for all sorts of other criminal investigations, and that makes a lot of people nervous.
A New York court was the first to strike down some of the new surveillance powers authorized by the Patriot Act.
Section 505 allows the federal government to demand a person's individual records, their internet access, their emails, basically a lot of things that people view as private or their own, without any warrant from a court. See, before the Patriot Act, the government would have to show to a court that they could get a warrant and that there was a criminal investigation. So it's very different and allows the government to get personal information about any individual. A court in New York has now struck down this provision of the Patriot Act. Other courts are likely to hear it, and eventually it may be resolved by the Supreme Court about whether this ability of the government to get personal information about you goes too far and undermines all of our senses of privacy.
But supporters are adamant that the Patriot Act is a good law.
Supporters of the Patriot Act, say it has given the government the right powers to go after terrorists and to stop terrorist attacks. Their proof is that there's been no successful terrorist attack in America since September 11th. And what they basically say is the Patriot Act is responsible for helping the federal government in stopping potential terrorist attack, and that we should give our federal government all the resources it needs to ensure our safety and to ensure that we don't have a repeat of what happened in September of 2001.
Supporters of the act also say there's not really anything new in this law. Federal agents investigating drug dealers and mobsters, for example, already use roving wiretaps. They see the Patriot Act as more of the same, and an effective way to keep our country out of harm's way. This country was founded on the principle that individual freedoms must be protected. But the world is different now. We live in a world of terrorism, and that isn't going to change. Maybe it's time we did. In many European countries, for instance, every citizen has an identification card to prove that they're a legal resident. Americans don't. In other countries, such as Israel, soldiers routinely stop people at airports and in roadblocks. American soldiers don't stop citizens without getting permission from the courts. There are many questions that remain about the future of the Patriot Act. Will Congress vote to renew provisions of the Act as they expire? Or will they decide to get rid of some parts of the law? Will the courts continue to rule that certain sections of the Patriot Act are unconstitutional? Only time will tell. But odds are pretty good that we will be living with at least some form of the Patriot Act for years to come. The Patriot Act was designed to help protect the U.S. from terrorist threats. How is the Patriot Act used to monitor terrorists? How might these provisions affect a law-abiding U.S. citizen? Political debate can be time-consuming and frustrating, but it often leads to compromise. In what ways do you think the Patriot Act might have been different if politicians had spent more time debating the law? What does the first non-white woman to serve in the U.S. Congress have to do with professional women's sports? Everything. Congresswoman Patsy Mink grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii, the daughter of second-generation Japanese parents. Throughout her life, Mink faced discrimination, and everywhere she went, she fought back. Mink was a Japanese American living in the Hawaiian Islands soon after Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese. That made growing up there difficult. When Mink went to college at the University of Nebraska, she was forced to live in segregated housing because she was a non-white student. And when Mink applied to the law school at the University of Chicago, the school's policy against admitting women would have kept her out, if the admissions office hadn't thought that Patsy was a man's name. Mink took these experiences to heart. She believed that women like her deserved equal treatment. And that's how she came to be the author of the Title IX Amendment of the Higher Education Act passed in 1972. Title IX was originally passed in 1972. Though it called for equality in all areas of education, it also focused on giving more athletic opportunities to women and increasing the number of college scholarships for female athletes.
Title IX has been instrumental in the change of expectations for women in terms of sports. The opportunities that it created at the college level filtered down into creating opportunities at the high school level and the youth level, all the way up to our professional teams.
Since the law was passed, the number of women playing intercollegiate sports has grown from about 30,000 to 150,000.
I've been playing since I was 3 or 4. It's kind of the earliest pictures I'm with a ball. And my mom was the one kind of spearheading it. She actually started a soccer program up in Iowa, where I'm from, and was very supportive. My dad was there too, but I don't know, my mom is a big part of it and a big part of me getting into sports, even though she never played herself.
A lot of controversy surrounding Title IX comes from guidelines issued in 1979 from the U.S. Department of Education. The government guidelines stated that colleges had to prove they were giving equal athletic opportunities to men and women.
College implements Title IX by showing that they're basically being fair. They can do that in a couple of different ways. One is showing proportionality. That means if 50% of the students in the school are female, then 50% of the school's athletic resources needs to go to women. They can also do it by showing that they're meeting all the kind of requested needs, that all the women who want to play sports, or men for that matter, have the opportunity to play. And if they can't reach that mark right away, they have to show that they're working towards it, that they're making efforts to meet those guidelines.
Not surprisingly, the number of college sports teams for women has risen dramatically.
College budgets are usually limited, and they're not growing as quickly as the needs are. So often administrations have to make difficult choices. They have to take some of the money that they would have spent on men's sports and maybe spend them on women's sports to get into that proportionality. Usually the big sports aren't as affected, but the lesser men's sports are, and sometimes it means that an athletic director has to make a difficult choice and drop one sport to add another.
And it's important to remember that it isn't only about equal opportunity. It's also about providing the same level of experience for all athletes.
Title IX encourages equality. It can be equality of opportunity, which means teams to play on, but it also means the equality of experience. You can't have one team staying at a fancy hotel and having $100 a day for meal money and the other one eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and taking a minivan. They want to make sure that the experience of men and women, all athletes, is very similar at the end of the day.
I definitely love the game and everything. I'll be playing, until they kick me off the field, and once my kids come, I'll coach their teams and, just encourage them to play as much as they can or want to.
Despite the obvious benefits for players like Liza Barber, other athletes say what's happening to them isn't fair. In the past 2 decades, for instance, the number of college men's wrestling teams has shrunk from 363 to 250. That's left many people worried that women's sports are being favored through Title IX. At a time when athletes like soccer star Mia Hamm are as well known as her baseball star husband, Nomar Garcia-Parra, is Title IX really necessary? When Patsy Mink was growing up, women couldn't even be admitted to most law schools, never mind getting on a basketball team. But nowadays, sports programs are pretty even, right? Why not just do away with the law? There are those who argue that its time has passed. In May of 2002, the National Wrestling Coaches Association filed a lawsuit against the United States Department of Education. They claimed that Title IX created a quota system. Quotas are rules requiring specific numbers of certain groups, such as men or women. The use of quotas has been ruled unconstitutional in other cases. In 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court outlawed quotas in the Allen Bakke case. Bakke was a white man who had been rejected from a California medical school, while some minority students with lower test scores were admitted using a quota system.
The opponents of Title IX feel that athletic opportunities at the intercollegiate level should reflect the demand that's made on them. So if there are not many women requesting opportunities to play sports, then they have the allocation of the resources that they need. They feel that we shouldn't be in the business of creating a vacuum to be filled by future people.
The wrestling coaches lost their case on appeal in 2004. The statistics show that even after 30 years with Title IX, girls have fewer opportunities to participate in high school and college sports, and get about $133 million less in scholarship funds than men. The question for many is why.
In some ways, it's like the chicken or the egg. Are there fewer women in sports because there are fewer opportunities for those women, or are there fewer opportunities for those women because there are fewer women who are demanding them?
Title IX is meant to ensure that opportunities continue to exist until that question no longer needs to be asked. There's an old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Is that true for female athletes today? Certainly the Title IX law has forced many schools to change the types of programs that women have available to them. But it's also true that the law has pulled limited dollars from some of the less popular men's sports, and that hurts male athletes. Current law says that after a university decides to eliminate a team, no outside group, say a group of alumni wrestlers, can contribute funds to keep the program alive either. Some critics think changing that one piece of the law might be a good compromise. Others say that the money should be split 50-50 between men's and women's teams, and that if colleges shared money for male sports evenly among bigger and smaller men's teams, there wouldn't be so many teams being cut. In 2002, George W. Bush renamed Title IX the Patsy T. Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act. Political analysts think that there's still so much support for the law that it won't change anytime soon. What do you think? Is it time to change Title IX or get rid of it altogether? Or does Patsy Mink's life work still need to be done? Since Title IX is about equality, why not simply divide a college's annual sports budget in half between men's and women's teams? What other factors need to be considered? Leadership and being a team player are important qualities in the business world. Do you think any links could be drawn between the passage of Title IX and the growth of women in management positions in American business? Why or why not? Friends often tell each other they've got each other's back. What exactly does that mean? Having a friend or ally can be critical when you're feeling threatened. Countries need friends too. Countries who band together are called allies. Sometimes there are formal agreements between countries, but often it's a case of publicly supporting one another. For example, many nations disagreed with the U.S. decision to invade Iraq in 2002. During this difficult diplomatic period when the United States was being criticized throughout the world, Prime Minister Tony Blair came to the United States and literally stood next to President George W. Bush to make the point that he was standing with the U.S. The United States and Great Britain have been allies for a long time. Our countries have many of the same interests, give citizens the same freedoms, and often approach conflicts in the same way. That doesn't mean we agree on everything, but in general, our countries are similar enough that a relationship makes sense. But alliances can also be made between countries that are very different. What happened immediately after 9/11 is a good example of the way that countries can come together at difficult times. Two of the first countries to offer support to the U.S. after September 11th were Great Britain and Russia, which was once part of the Soviet Union. Great Britain has been an ally of the United States for many years, but our history with Russia and the Soviet Union has been much more troubled. During the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. and the Soviets were the world's two big superpowers. For decades, we faced off against each other in what became known as the Cold War, because conflict never actually broke out between our militaries. Both countries spied on each other and tried to beat one another in creating new weapons. During the Kennedy administration, things between us got so tense that we came very close to a nuclear war. Being an ally to another country isn't easy. Recently, the United States has angered some of its long-term allies because of the decisions it has made.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
After the attacks of September 11th, President George W. Bush responded with the Bush Doctrine. It included a number of major changes to our foreign policy, the way we deal with other countries.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
The Bush Doctrine outlines a new way to behave in the face of terrorism. His policy is to spread democracy and to remain a superpower. The president says countries with ties to terrorism are part of an axis of evil that he vows to break. In the past, America's policy on war has been deterrence. That means avoiding war unless absolutely necessary and acting in self-defense. But the Bush Doctrine supports preemption. America will now strike first when necessary.
A month after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the president went to war against Afghanistan because Afghanistan refused to turn over the perpetrator, Osama bin Laden. And in 2002, Congress authorized the use of force against Iraq because of the desire to prevent Iraq from continuing its weapons of mass destruction programs.
Searching for someone who attacked us was one thing, but the Iraq War was preempted. Iraq had not attacked us first. That upset many of our traditional allies.
The Bush administration brought together a coalition of the willing, a group of nations that were willing to supply troops to go to war in Iraq. They included largely U.S. troops and troops from the United Kingdom, but also troops from Australia and Poland and a few other nations, actually. Most importantly, however, France and Germany refused to send their troops. They disagreed with the policy. They did not want to participate because they felt that the presence of UN inspectors would do a much better job at preventing Iraq from continuing its weapons of mass destruction program and destroying any of those weapons that existed.
Does it matter what other countries think about us? Anti-American feelings can affect all sorts of things. Tourism and trade, even a country's leadership.
Germany and South Korea, two of our traditional allies, elected leaders on a platform opposed to U.S. policy. There is in general a fear that the United States is trying to go it alone, something that is very dangerous in today's international security environment.
How do we choose when to work closely with other countries and when to take the lead or go it alone without much worldwide support? Throughout America's history, these choices have caused controversy. George Washington once said, America should have commercial relationships with foreign countries, but as little political connection as possible. Throughout our history, presidents have gone back and forth on the issue. The difference in attitude can be striking.
The first President Bush felt that alliances were very important to U.S. national security. He came to power at a time of enormous change. The Cold War was ending after 40 years, and he understood that to protect Americans, it was important for the American president to maintain friendships and alliances with many other nations. He even extended a hand to our former enemies, the Soviet Union.
The elder Bush built long-lasting diplomatic ties with other countries, too. When Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990 and threatened to attack Saudi Arabia, the president worked to gather support before responding.
When Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait, the first President Bush responded by creating an enormous coalition of 36 nations backed by the United Nations. It cost $80 billion in today's dollars, and it worked. Moreover, almost all of that money was reimbursed by allies, including Saudi Arabia, Germany, and Japan.
This is a fact. Strength in the pursuit of peace is no vice. Isolationism in the pursuit of security is no virtue.
Many people now worry about what will happen to the long-term relationships the U.S. forged over decades with Britain, Western European nations, Canada, Japan, and others. Maintaining these alliances over time traditionally meant discussing issues as equals. Under the second Bush administration, coalitions are often created quickly around specific issues. And within those coalitions, the U.S. has been taking the lead in most decision-making. What that will mean to our longtime allies is hard to predict. Experts say that the Bush Doctrine is likely to set the tone for our relationships with other countries for decades to come. But in one recent poll, about 3/4 of Americans said they want the U.S. to share the role of world leadership. Is it possible to continue the Bush Doctrine and share world leadership? Perhaps the world has changed enough that one-time-only coalitions make more sense than long-term partnerships. Or we may have to rethink foreign policy once again and move back toward a more collaborative approach to working with other countries. The two President Bushes have approached foreign policy very differently. In what ways might the world political situation during the time of each presidency have affected how these men dealt with other countries? Some argue it's dangerous to get too close to other countries. Others say it's dangerous to be too distant. What are the potential pitfalls of each approach? Minimum wage is the amount of money it takes to make sure that employees, especially those with minimal skills and education, are paid fairly for their work. The idea is that in order to protect low-wage workers from being taken advantage of, the government will decide on a fair and reasonable amount of money that they should earn for their work. That rate will be the least, or minimum, that anyone can earn per hour of work. The minimum wage has gone up over the years, but it is not raised on a regular basis. Congress must agree on an increase and pass a bill which the President then signs into law. In early 2005, for instance, the minimum wage was $5.15 an hour. Republicans and Democrats both wanted it to be raised, but the Republican plan called for a raise of about $1, and the Democratic plan was for an increase of $2. Without an agreement, the minimum wage stayed put at $5.15. Not everyone believes that the minimum wage is a good thing. Some people think it is actually harmful to the least skilled, least experienced workers, especially teenagers. According to the 1981 report of the Minimum Wage Study Commission, there was a 46% rise in the minimum wage between 1977 and 1981. The commission said that this led to the loss of 644,000 jobs held by teenagers because when businesses have to pay each worker more, they are forced to fire their least skilled workers. And because they have to pay higher wages, businesses also expect workers to be better qualified. Other people think that the minimum wage is bad for low-skilled workers because it doesn't pay them enough to live on. They want to increase the minimum wage to something called a living wage. A living wage is the amount that it takes to adequately pay for housing, food, medical care, and other basic necessities. About 40 cities and counties nationwide require businesses to pay living wages that are higher than the minimum wage, including Boston, Baltimore, Los Angeles, and Chicago. If minimum wage isn't enough to live on, as the living wage supporters claim, how does a family living on minimum wage make ends meet? Susan is one of 11 million minimum and low-wage workers in this country. She works between 40 and 60 hours each week at low-paying jobs to support her family.
I work 2 jobs. I have 4 children. I probably get up in the morning at 5 o'clock in the morning, wake my son up for school, get him ready. Sometimes we'll jump back in bed for a 10-minute nap, if I can take one. And then I get up and I get ready I work an after-school-based curriculum program for children after school. And I have to be there usually by 2. A couple of times a month I have to be there by 12. I get out of there 6:30. Then I come home, I change. 3 or 4 nights a week I work at a local donut shop, and I work there till closing. which can be 1 or 2 in the morning. So sometimes I have to make a decision whether to sleep or not to sleep so that I can be up to make sure my son gets up to go to school. I make lunches and then send everybody off and then go to work, come home, sometimes throw something in the microwave for dinner if there's no baseball that day for one of my children, and get ready, go to work, come home, start the whole thing all over again. And that's every day.
The federal minimum wage was introduced in 1938. Most small businesses have to pay workers who don't earn tips a minimum wage. The majority of minimum wage earners are women who work full-time.
And everything I've done so far in my life has been 100% worth it. As much as I can cry at night and as tired as I am, and sometimes I can't even lift my head up off the pillow, I would do it all over again for them, because it's all about them. That's why I work 2 jobs. I could have gone on public assistance, but I chose not to, because those would have brought in certain roadblocks for my children in a way also. And it's all been about them. So everything that I've done, I'd do again. I'd take a 3rd job if I had to, just so that they can go on in this world and have the choices that I was able to give them, you know, so.
1 in 3 minimum wage earners today is the sole breadwinner for her family. But it's tough to get by. The National Low Income Housing Coalition says that minimum wage would have to be doubled for workers to comfortably pay for housing in most cities. That leaves workers like Susan spending so much time trying to get by, they don't have the time to get ahead.
I'd love to go back to school. I'd love to further my education. I'd love to take training classes in something, but I can't because there's no time. And if there's time, there's no money. And if there's money, I need that for my children for the things that they need. So there's really nothing right now that I can possibly do at this stage in my life to make anything better, because it's a balance of children or work.
Most American workers make more than twice the minimum wage. The minimum wage is less than half of the average U.S. hourly wage of $14 an hour. That's not that much. But many people oppose raising the minimum wage because they say it hurts the economy. A survey in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2005 reports that 2 out of 3 economists at the country's top universities believe that the minimum wage actually increases unemployment among the young and unskilled workers. They argue that the minimum wage increases what is called disemployment, namely that in order to cover the rise in base pay, companies will have to lay off some workers. Critics also feel that the minimum wage contributes to higher prices for goods and services, since employers pass the higher cost of salaries onto consumers. Not everyone agrees, but for many small businesses, raising wages can be a struggle. Rosie Pianka has owned her own beauty salon for the past 2 years. It's a small shop with lots of challenges.
I have a few hairdressers that maybe part-timers. They come in, they maybe do a little bit and then they leave, and it's hard to pay them. It's hard really to pay them if they don't have any customers, because then that money's coming right out of my pocket, actually. And then after you pay the bills, there's really not much left. It's hard there's no health benefits or anything like that, because unless they're really busy, which takes a long time. I don't even have my own.
There are about 10 million privately held firms in the United States. About half are small businesses with fewer than 500 employees.
I really love doing what I do, but it's hard to have it in your own business. Maybe it is better off sometimes to work for somebody else and not have to worry about the wages you have to pay somebody or the amount of hours you're going to spend there and the bills that come in and the simple little things like the taxes and the sales tax. That's all really business stuff, when really I just want to be a hairdresser. So it's hard to do both at the same time, and when you can't afford to have the employees there, you're running it yourself. You're the maid, you're the cleaner, you're the hairdresser, the bookkeeper, and everything else that goes along with it.
America's top job creators are small businesses. But these days, small employers are already facing huge increases in health insurance costs. Raising the minimum wage would simply be too big a burden for many.
The idea of having the minimum wage raised would be really hard for someone like me, because if I'd have to pay them, say even a receptionist, to come in and sit there and get paid a higher wage, that would mean less money for me, which I'm not really getting any of myself right now anyways because of the bills and having the business, keeping it running. And even it's hard to spend all your time there and all day, and you'd be giving your money, more of your money away that you're not really getting. So I don't know if you'd be able to stay in business very long if you had to do that, being a small business.
Opponents of the minimum wage say that nearly 2/3 of minimum wage workers end up earning more than that rate within 1 year. They say allowing employers to pay a low wage until workers have some skills and experience motivates workers to try and move up. The minimum wage was put into place nearly 70 years ago in order to protect workers, many of whom were moving away from agricultural jobs such as farming and into industry. In the years ahead, a growing number of American workers are expected to be employed in service industries, such as restaurant work. The country is also expecting a very large number of baby boomers to retire, and that's got many economists predicting a labor shortage in almost every field. Businesses could respond by raising their base hourly pay to attract qualified workers. If that happened, would we even need a minimum wage? Or does the government still have a responsibility to protect low-skilled workers? And there are other questions to think about. Should all workers be guaranteed a living wage? And if so, can we raise the minimum wage to meet this standard without hurting small businesses or the economy? These questions will likely be debated by Congress, business owners, and workers for years to come. How might raising the minimum wage hurt low-wage earners rather than help them? In what other ways might the government encourage low-wage earners to increase their earning potential? What do you think might happen to pay rates and low-wage workers if the minimum wage was abolished? Most Americans say that the education of our children is a national priority. 85% of Americans surveyed in a recent poll rated education as very important to them. Public education costs a lot of money. In fact, the U.S. Department of Education's budget is about $63 billion. That sounds like a lot, and it is. But it is actually less than 3% of the federal government's entire budget of nearly $3 trillion. Most schools get the bulk of their money from their state and local governments, and much of the money for a community's public schools comes from property taxes that local homeowners and businesses pay on the estimated or assessed value of their property. Some people say this is a bad system and that there should be a federal tax so that all public schools are funded the same way. One of the problems is that some communities have less expensive homes, which means their property taxes bring in less money for their schools than communities with higher-priced homes. Some states have tried to fix this using a controversial program called reapportionment. That means taxes from different communities get pooled together and spread around to everyone in the state, instead of staying in the town where they were collected. Some people say that means communities with more money are being forced to pay for the education of communities with less, and that should be the federal government's job. So, although education is a high priority for citizens, the federal government spends a relatively small portion of its annual budget on it. And the way local communities fund schools is not always considered fair. And the cost of education is going up. Recent surveys have found that school districts need $322 billion in new spending. That's because the average school building today is about 43 years old and is in need of increased maintenance and repairs. You can see where this is going. Local and state governments are already paying the bulk of the cost of running schools. The cost of education is rising and doesn't seem fair to everyone. And many communities say there's just not enough money to go around. We've all heard the expression, safety first. But in cities and towns across the country, the cost to keep communities safe is rising.
Speaking just on the fire department issues, we've become very, very diverse recently because there's some terrorism issues, there's some training issues. The equipment we use is very sophisticated, it's very expensive. So the funding that we really need to operate the fire department has to be increased substantially every year.
Adding equipment, services, and personnel costs towns and cities money. And when money is added to a local government's budget, it has to be subtracted somewhere else. Running the schools is one of the biggest items in any town's budget. That means that communities often face a difficult choice between spending money on safety or using it to provide the best education for their children.
It's a very, very difficult process. I understand because I am in the budgetary process with the fire department, there are certain costs which go up dramatically, healthcare costs that the city has no control over. So every dollar that the city has to spend somewhere else is a dollar less that we are able to apply for in our budget.
In Deputy Fire Chief Colangeli's town, cutting corners has led to some tough choices. To stay on budget, he has had to place some of the town's firefighting vehicles and equipment out of service during part of the year.
It's a very, very dangerous precedent, but it's a matter of economics, it's dollars and cents. And when it comes down to that, then we have to do what we have to do. We certainly want more firefighters. We've had drastic reductions in numbers of firefighters and apparatus over the years, and our workload has increased dramatically, along with the population.
The problem of financing both important safety services and the schools would likely go away if the federal government would pick up a bigger portion of the cost of education. Some state and local officials say the federal government makes rules that force them to spend additional money on education, but then doesn't follow up with financial support.
In 2002, George Bush signed the No Child Left Behind law. This was an education reform law that brought about new reforms for school districts. These reforms, such as new testing, additional certifications for teachers, and new standards and programs that need to be met, were all brought into school districts.
In Ohio, for example, the state says it will spend about $1.5 billion a year to comply with the No Child Left Behind law. That's more than twice as much money as it gets from the federal government for education.
The states are saying that they have to create new tests and that they have to improve their testing system, and it's costing a lot of money.
And that leaves some critics asking, how much is too much to spend on education? The Bush administration believes it has done its part to help states. The annual federal funding for K-12 education has increased more than 40% since President Bush took office. In fact, spending on Title I, which supports low-income schools and is the largest program under the No Child Left Behind law, rose almost $5 billion from 2000 to 2004. But decisions made at the local, state, and federal level about how to fund education have a direct impact on real people, especially students. And not everyone agrees with those decisions. You get what you pay for. How many times have you heard that? Some people think it's never been more true than it is in education. High school junior Julie Hancock has been leading a fight to give more money to urban and struggling schools for 6 long years.
The perfect solution would be if there's more money, because then if there was more money, then they could hire more teachers, which would decrease the class sizes, and they could buy more computers, and so that students would have the opportunity to use more computers, and they'd buy more books and stuff. So money is the main solution. It's just the problem how to get that money.
Hancock and students from 19 other school districts sued the state of Massachusetts because of what they considered unequal school funding. But the courts threw out their claims, saying they'd have to review the issue further. By then, it will be too late to do much for Julie.
It's very frustrating because I can see every single day, I can see all the inadequacies in the funding, and so when the courts can go and say, like, oh, the state has made some progress and things are happening, I don't see it too much. I mean, small progress has been made, but something needs to be done soon.
Disagreement over how to fund public education is nothing new. President Nixon considered creating a new federal sales tax to fund public schools back in the 70s. Others think we should have a federal income tax and give money out to states on the basis of how many students they have.
A fair federal income tax would certainly be the best way to fund schools in this country. State and local property taxes really don't fund schools properly. We really need a national tax that will take care of all of the schools equally and evenly.
The U.S. actually spends a greater share of its national income on K-12 education than most other countries.
The fact that schools are not equally funded is really the problem. I understand that the federal government believes that we spend a tremendous amount of money on education, but the problem is how it's distributed, and it's not always distributed so that every student gets the maximum benefit. I know people are trying, but we really need to do better in this for everybody.
Education is clearly important, not only for individuals, but also for the economic future of this country. We need students to be prepared for great jobs, but we also need them to help our country compete with the rest of the world. Unfortunately, there are limited dollars to go around in communities. Who should get them? Where should the money come from? The dollars that could be spent educating students could just as easily be spent on making our community safer or helping low-income or elderly people get by. Balancing the needs of all our citizens and figuring out how to divide up the local, state, and federal budgets is a problem of a very high order. In what ways might a change in how schools are funded at the state, local, and federal level make education more equitable for all students and communities? Community funds are limited, and local budgets include many worthy groups, such as schools and police and fire departments. Why do so many communities choose to spend the largest portion of their budgets on schools? Do you think this is a wise decision?